Well, hey, everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to North Shore. My name is Scotty Scruggs. I'm the pastor here, and I'm so glad that you're joining us this weekend, whether you're here in this room or you're watching online from wherever you're watching from. We're super glad that you're here. And before we get started, I just want to say a quick word for those of you who were part of Kickoff Sunday last month. It's been over 45 days since we launched that 45-day prayer challenge. And some of you have been praying for something really, really big, and we would love to hear more of that story. So if you have a story about that, shoot us an email, reach out to us online, come back to guest services and tell about your story. We'd love to know what God has been doing in your life, because that's what we're about around here at North Shore, what God is doing in our lives. But if it's your first time here, or maybe your first time in a while, you picked a really good weekend to be at church, because we're starting a brand new message series called How to Stand For What You Believe In. When I was 18 years old, I left my home in Arkansas to go to college at Stanford University in California. As some of you know, Stanford's biggest rival is the University of California at Berkeley. It's one of the oldest football rivalries in college football. It's called the Big Game. It's been played since the year 1892. But it's not just the players who are rivals. The students are rivals as well. Cal students make fun of Stanford because our mascot is a dancing tree. And Stanford students make fun of Cal students because they have to go to Cal. But being from Arkansas, I didn't know any of this until my very first big game, which just happened to be across the bay in Berkeley. And it was a close game. Stanford ended up losing by just 1 point. But what I remember most about that game is when the clock ran out, all the Cal students stormed out onto the field, but they didn't just celebrate in the middle of the field. They actually gathered in front of our student section. And they started pointing to the scoreboard and yelling and taunting and even throwing stuff at us. And I remember thinking, we need to get out of here. This isn't safe. But then someone from my dorm said, we have to stay and stand up for our school. And I wanted to say, look, I'm from Arkansas. I'm just kind of visiting out here. I'm not part of this whole thing. But I stayed. And we just stood there, standing for our team in front of all those Cal fans and their jaded little souls. But here's my point. It is a powerful thing to stand for what you believe in, to have the courage to stand for what's right or what's true. And this is especially true for followers of Jesus, because when we stand for the right things in the right way, we honor God and we bless other people and we grow spiritually. But the reverse is also true. When we stand for the wrong things, or we stand for the right things, but in the wrong way, we can dishonor God and we can hurt other people and we don't grow. In fact, I think one of the most discouraging trends in the church right now is that people's primary posture isn't this, it's something else. Their posture is more like how to stand against what they believe in, right? And they could be almost anybody. They might be liberals, they might be conservatives, they might be proponents of critical race theory, they might be the LGBTQ community. Regardless of whoever they are, there's this growing fear that they are threatening our way of life. They are threatening our values. They are threatening how we raise our kids. And so we have to beat them. We have to win the culture war against them, whoever they may be. Now, just so you know, I'm not saying that they are right or what they believe is right. I'm just naming the fact that more and more Christians have this posture of how to stand against what they believe in. But here's the thing, this is not your job. Your job is to learn how to stand for what you believe in, which means you actually have to know what you believe in. And you have to know how to stand for it in a way that points people to God, not away from him. And by the way, if you're not sure about Jesus or Christianity, this conversation is still really relevant for you as well, because some of the stuff that you don't like about how Christians stand out is the same stuff that God doesn't like about how Christians stand out. And it's not just Christians who can do this poorly. This is a huge problem in politics today, both on the left and on the right. It's a huge problem in the media, whether it's social media or cable news or in the newspapers. By the way, for those of you under 30, a newspaper is just pages of the internet printed and delivered to your house. Okay, that's a newspaper. So for the next few weeks, we're gonna talk about how God calls us to stand for what we believe in. And to help us do that, we're gonna be exploring this great little book in the Old Testament, a book called Daniel. Now, for those of you who grew up going to Sunday school, you'll know many of the stories from the book of Daniel. The lion's den, the fiery furnace, the writing on the wall. And then there was this evil king with that really long name. Anyone remember his name? Yeah, that's King Nebuchadnezzar, that's right. In fact, I heard about a church where every time the pastor said Nebuchadnezzar, the congregation yelled, boo. So you wanna try that real quick? Nebuchadnezzar. There you go. That's not bad, but that's the only time you get to do it because it'll get really annoying if you keep doing that, okay? So just the one time. But Daniel's life really at its core is just a case study in how to stand for what you believe in. So let's get started with chapter 1 in verse 1. That's how it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of I knew that was gonna happen. Now stop it or we'll be here all day, okay? Which as a pastor, I have no problem with that, but you're gonna be stuck here all day. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put them in the treasure house of his God. Now notice, the story begins not with like once upon a time, but in this very particular moment in history, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now, to understand the significance of this moment, we need to do a very quick history lesson, okay? So as some of you know, when Israel first became a nation, they were led by a king named Saul. And Saul led Israel for about 40 years. And then after Saul, King David was king, and he expanded the kingdom in some very powerful ways, and he led for about 40 years. And then after David, the nation of Israel was led by his son Solomon, who also led for about 40 years. And it was during the reign of Solomon that the first temple was built in Jerusalem in the year 966 BC. Now, why is that important? Because the temple was the fulfillment of everything they believed God had promised. Like going all the way back to Abraham, this was the fulfillment of all that God had promised them. His presence, their land, their ability to worship. So the temple became the heart of Israel's identity and the center of their life and worship. It was like what Silicon Valley is for tech, or Hollywood is for movies, or what Seattle is for rain. It was like the very center of the target, okay? But after Solomon died, the kingdom split into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And if you're wondering, the split was over taxes, because it's always about taxes, isn't it? Right? It's always about taxes. But neither kingdom was faithful to God, and so God allowed both kingdoms to be conquered. The northern kingdom, Israel, was conquered by Assyria in the year 722 BC, and Judah was conquered by Babylon in 605 BC. This year, 605, was the 3rd year in the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Are you with me? Yep, a little bit. As we just read, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just invade the city, he actually defiled and later destroyed their temple. He actually took objects from the Holy of Holies back to his temple in Babylon, which is like the ultimate insult, the ultimate taunt, the ultimate pointing to the scoreboard. Who's winning now, Israel? And friends, this is the backdrop for everything we're gonna read in this book of Daniel. Jerusalem is conquered, the temple's destroyed. They couldn't live their lives the way they used to. They couldn't raise their kids the way they used to. They couldn't practice their faith the way they used to. It was a season of total devastation and loss. In fact, there's a book in the Old Testament called Lamentations that describes the just sheer anguish people felt about this moment in their history. But here's the thing. King Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't want to destroy Israel. He wanted to assimilate it. Look at verse 3. It says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. You see, this is a lot more of a corporate acquisition than it is an invasion, where you take the best talent and the best IP back with you to build an even stronger company. So Nebuchadnezzar took back the best and brightest of Israel. They were enrolled in Babylonian schools. They were fed Babylonian meals. They read Babylonian books. They watched the great Babylonian baking show. Like, they were all in immersion of Babylon, okay? And in this group of young men was a 15-year-old, scholars believe about a 15-year-old boy named Daniel. Text goes on to say, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, this is probably the most insidious part of this assimilation strategy. Their Hebrew names, just so you know, were all references to their God, Yahweh. But now, their new names are all these references to the various Babylonian gods. So Babylon was literally trying to redefine their basic identity. Once again, look at the scoreboard. Who's winning now? So you can imagine, just imagine the hostility, the resentment, the frustration, the anger they would have felt. And wouldn't you? I can tell you, I would have been fluctuating between contempt towards this new enemy of mine and frustration about all these new, horrible, frustrating circumstances. And by the way, isn't this what so many Christians in our day are thinking or feeling right now? You see, more and more people have this growing fear that we're losing our culture, we're losing our values, we're losing our way of life, which leads to bitterness and contentment towards whoever is we see or define as the other team, right? Could be the media or the woke or the vaxxers or the anti-vaxxers. We're contempt over whoever the enemy is. And then we experience all this frustration day after day about how this impacts the circumstances of our lives, masks and mandates, and on it goes. The good news is, if you're feeling this way, you are not alone. Daniel and his friends went from being in control to having no control, from being part of a God-honoring culture to living in what looked like a God-forsaken one. So it would make sense if their response was filled with contempt and frustration. But here's what's so amazing. It wasn't. It wasn't. In fact, if you read through, and we'll do this as we go through the book of Daniel, Daniel never acted in contempt or frustration, and neither did his friends. Because, and this is really important, God gave them a new way to do life in Babylon. Like a whole new paradigm, a whole new way of life. God actually spoke to the people who were captives in Babylon through the prophet Jeremiah, who sent Daniel and the other captives a letter, not long after they were taken. And the text of this letter, it exists today. It's found in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, and it's essential to how we understand the book of Daniel. Look at what Jeremiah writes. He says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So that's all the folks we just read about. And look what he says. I mean, this is shocking. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Notice, nowhere in this does God say, get even, get mad, win the war. He says, settle down. Plant gardens. Have families. Start businesses. Enroll in school. Go out to eat. Join a gym. In other words, don't be hostile, make a home. And I can imagine the Israelites were thinking, but God, can we at least, keep to ourselves? Can we create these little enclaves, these little holy huddles where we can be together and keep our distance from this evil, gross, immoral culture? And God said, no, you can't. Look at what Jeremiah says next. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, not against it, because if it prospers, you too will what? Prosper. And by the way, prosper here doesn't mean financial prosperity. It means thriving or flourishing in a holistic way. So guess what, Israel? Your job is to help Babylon, the enemy, flourish. Not by praying against it, but by praying for it. Not by seeking disruption, but by seeking peace. Friends, this is how to live when you're not in Jerusalem. This is how God calls his people to live when they are living in a hostile or seemingly foreign environment. And by the way, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but if you are a follower of Jesus in the United States today, you are not living in Jerusalem anymore. We are not living in a Christian culture. Whether it was in the past or how much it was in the past is a debate for another day, but it's not today. Especially here in the Pacific Northwest. City of Seattle has the largest percentage of atheists of any large city in the country. And the state of Washington is ranked as one of the least religious states in the country, which means if we want to be faithful in our context, we have to live more like Daniel. And to do that, we have to actually change our mindset in three key ways. The first shift is from seeing ourselves as just citizens in a Christian context or Christian culture to being missionaries in a secular one. Because you see, when I'm just a citizen in a Christian culture, I expect everything around me to look Christian. The government should be Christian, the values should be Christian, the politicians should be Christian, the schools should be Christians. But missionaries don't expect their surroundings to look Christian at all. They don't get angry when the culture is opposed to God. They know it is. That's why they live there. So they could do something about it. Which leads to a second shift, which is from a posture of wanting to avoid the culture to seeking to transform the culture. See, when you're living in Jerusalem, everything in you kind of wants to avoid everything that looks or talks or smells like Babylon, right? Don't see that movie, don't go to that wedding, don't read that book, don't participate in stuff like Halloween because it will corrupt you, right? But God didn't call the exiles to avoid Babylon, he called them to transform Babylon. Build homes, plant gardens, have families, invest in the city, increase in number. It almost sounds like what God said to Adam in the garden: make a home, tend the garden, increase in number. And I'm pretty sure God wasn't saying avoid Eden. He was saying transform it, enhance it, invest in it. Which leads to a third shift, which is from focusing on just building a church to blessing the city to which you've been called. Now, there's nothing wrong with building or growing a church. That's part of what we're called to do. But what can happen over time is that when we focus on this, we become kind of relationally segregated from people outside the church. Most of our close friends will be Christian. Most of our activities are with Christians or they're church related. But in Exile, the focus moves from here to blessing the city. Hey, while we're here, while we're in Babylon, let's try to reduce the divorce rate. While we're here, while we're in Babylon, let's make sure there's no kids who are experiencing homelessness. While we're here, while we're in Babylon, let's make sure we put a stop to domestic violence or to child abuse, because that would bless our city. In fact, I think every church should be asking the question, a real simple one: would our city miss us if we were gone? Every church should be asking this question: would our city actually miss us if we were just up and gone and disappeared? Would the city council miss the ways that we reached out and served? Would the schools miss the ways we would support them? Would our neighbors miss how we cared for them and their needs? Or would they not even notice? And by the way, this is where our Together For initiative comes from. Being a church together for our neighbors, the next generation, and those in need is based on this missional paradigm, this shift from here to here, because we're not in Jerusalem anymore either. Which means we're not just citizens, we're missionaries. And we're not here to avoid the culture, we're here to transform it. We're not just gonna build a church, we're gonna bless every city we're connected to. Now, just so you know, this change, this shift doesn't mean our job is to try to move through the world like real nice and easy and just try to blend in, right? If you're doing what Jesus says in your life, you are not going to blend in, I can guarantee it. Loving your enemies doesn't blend in. Sacrificial generosity doesn't blend in. Biblical sexuality doesn't blend in. And by the way, Daniel doesn't try to blend in either. In fact, he was willing to stand out and stand up for the right reasons. Look back at his story. The text in verse 8 says, but Daniel resolved, just flag that word resolve, we'll come back to that. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. And as you know the story, he goes on to ask for a diet of only vegetables and water. Now, before all the vegetarians in the room get real excited about this, Daniel wasn't just standing against meat or even against food that had been sacrificed to idols, because the vegetables would have been blessed to the Babylonian idols as well. He doesn't want to eat the royal food. Why? Because the food represents who is providing for him. The food represents who is providing for him. See, one of the best ways to stand for what you believe in is to make it clear not what's wrong with the world, but who provides for you. And by the way, it's not your savings account, it's not your resume, it's not your reputation, it's God. And notice, Daniel doesn't protest, he doesn't, post something, inflammatory on social media. He asked permission, kind of humbly, like, can we do this? In fact, he offers to make it kind of an experiment. I love this. He says, please, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants what? In accordance with what you see. Like, God's way of life better work, or this whole project's gonna fail. But friends, this is how faithfulness in exile, faithfulness in Babylon actually works. It is not an angry protest or a finger point or denouncing some other way of life or being against how they live. It's living out these humble alternatives to how people around you live. And these alternatives are designed to demonstrate that God is real and God provides. If God doesn't provide, if he's not real, this isn't gonna work. And I think this is how the church needs to approach living out our faith today. Less angry post, less pointing fingers, more creative, humble experiments and alternatives, like confessing your sins instead of hiding them so people can see that God actually forgives, or giving away money instead of holding on to it so people can see that God actually provides, or forgiving someone that's hurt you so people can see that God can heal even the deepest wounds. And then look at what happens. Look at what comes next. It says at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. See, I think Christians today, it's so easy for us to forget that following Jesus actually makes you better. Makes you better, not worse. Not saying it's easy, but it makes you better. We actually forget that we find more joy and contentment when we give, when we serve, when we honor God with our bodies, when we love our neighbors. And by the way, you don't have to do this for all the world to see. This isn't like making a huge public statement. Daniel did this to show what one court official would see. It was for the eyes of one person. And guess what happened? That person changed the diets for everybody else. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? So maybe Babylon isn't really gonna change Daniel at all. Maybe Daniel is there to change Babylon. And after 3 years of this, even the king took notice of what was happening. It says the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And as we'll see throughout this series, Daniel goes on to be in a position of power and authority and influence across the whole nation. But none of this would have happened had Daniel not had one thing. Remember the word I told you to remember? Resolve. Resolve. Remember, Daniel didn't decide not to eat the food just kind of on a whim. He didn't wake up one day and have a strange thought. The text said he resolved not to defile himself, meaning he decided, he put a stake in the ground. He predetermined what kind of person he wanted to be in Babylon. Not what kind of statement he would make about how bad Babylon is, but what kind of person he wanted to be when he was in Babylon. You see, being faithful in exile takes resolve. Standing up for what you believe in takes resolve. You got to decide ahead of time, I'm going to be faithful to my spouse when that moment of temptation comes. I'm going to pray for my enemies when that moment of attack comes. I'm going to give money away when that moment of a raise or promotion comes. Because here's the thing, anybody can stand against something else. That's easy. All you need is a social media account, and you can do that all day long. You can stand against whatever you want to stand against. But standing for what you believe in takes real resolve. And I have to tell you, there have been so many times in my life where I have lacked the resolve to stand for what I believed in. Someone started gossiping, and I just jumped right in. When kids in my school growing up wanted to cheat on a test, and I just jumped right in. When kids in college were drinking too much and I wanted to be liked and I wanted to blend in, so I just jumped right in. Because to be resolved, you have to have confidence in God. You have to be so convinced that He's in control that you're willing to trust Him, even when everything around you says, check out the scoreboard. Who do you think's winning out here? Some of you know the story of Elizabeth Elliott. Her husband, Jim Elliott, was a missionary who set out to reach a remote people group called the Huaorani. And they were in the Amazon jungle in Ecuador. And he went along with 4 other missionaries, and he set out by plane, and they built a little, like a base of operations just a few miles down the river from this tribe. But before they were able to make their first visit, they were speared to death by a group of Huaorani warriors. So you would think that his wife, Elizabeth, would be angry, would be resentful, would be hateful. She'd want nothing to do with these people who killed her own husband. But instead, you know what she did? She moved in to meet them. She traveled to meet them with her little 3-year-old daughter strapped in a backpack on her back. And she would spend 2 years in their village serving the very people that murdered her husband. She learned their language. She played with their children. They even gave her a new name. Sound familiar? And while she was there, the Huaorani got to hear about another great missionary who went to a foreign and hostile place to reach and transform a culture. And his name was Jesus. And he felt the tip of a spear as well on a cross where he died for our sins. Friends, that's resolve. That's standing for what you believe in. And when we live this kind of resolved way of life, guess what? God is always faithful because God is still in control. In fact, if you read back through Daniel 1, and I encourage you to do that this week, if you read through Daniel 1, you'll find the real power in the story isn't Nebuchadnezzar, it's God. It was God who gave Israel over to Babylon. It was God who caused the official to have a compassion on David. It was God who gave Daniel and his friends wisdom that made them 10 times better than everybody else. Why? Because God is actually still in control. And He's still in control today, no matter how much it looks like whoever they are winning, no matter how long this season we're in may last. I mean, think about it. Daniel spent his whole life in Babylon, from age 15 to over the age of 80 years old. He never saw the temple rebuilt. He never saw his home restored. But at the end of his life, the Bible says, while the other kings of Babylon came and went, Daniel prospered. Daniel 6:28. Daniel prospered. He thrived because he resolved to stand for what he believed in, moment after moment, story after story, challenge after challenge, and you can too. And I promise you, you will be 10 times better for it. So, closing question for each of you to consider today and for this week. Where do you need to be more resolved? Where do you need to trust that God is still in control? Where do you need to make a change to stand, not to stand against what they believe in, but for what you believe in? It could be around how you think or talk about them. It could be around what you say or share online. It could be about a struggle or temptation you need to address or confess. It could be about a relationship in your life that needs to change. It could be about a person you need to forgive or an apology you need to make. Where do you need to be more resolved? Because friends, when we are resolved, when you are resolved, God is faithful because he's in control. And he's always the most powerful person in the story, no matter what the scoreboard says. And that's where we're gonna pick up part 2 of the story next week. But for now, let me pray for you. Jesus, you were resolved to come out of heaven and come into exile on earth as a humble servant, giving us this alternative way to live, not just against the world, but for it, to reach it, to redeem it, to transform it. And you showed us how far your resolve would go by giving your life for us on a cross, because you loved that world. And so Jesus, we ask right now for the resolve to love this world that you've called us into exile in, that you've sent us out as missionaries on mission to reach people in your name and for your glory. Jesus, help us remember that no matter what the scoreboard out there is saying, you are still in control. You have all authority on heaven, on earth, and under the earth. So we can trust you. Help us fight this week, fight the good fight of standing for what you've called us to stand for in love and compassion and courage and conviction, so that people might see you in us. And Jesus, we pray that in your name. And everybody said, amen.